You have until the end of dinner to sign it, or I'll make sure my son files for divorce before the new year, and trust me, you won't like how that goes for you." My mother-in-law didn't raise her voice when she said it. She never raised her voice. That was the thing about Lorraine Ashworth. She had spent 30 years perfecting the particular tone of a woman who has never once needed to repeat herself. She said it the way you'd say pass the salt. Quiet, final, completely certain of the outcome. The document was sitting on the dining room table between the roasted squash and the gravy boat. 14 pages. A postnuptial agreement drafted by some Bay Street firm in Toronto, printed on the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than my first winter coat. Someone had placed a pen beside it, a good pen, the kind with a cap you twist rather than click. My husband, James, was sitting directly across from me. He was doing the thing he had been doing since we pulled up to his parents' house in Oakville 3 hours ago, studying the middle distance, very deliberately, like a man who has decided the safest place to be right now is nowhere. He wouldn't look at me. His father, Kenneth, sat at the head of the table and carved the roast with the slow, precise movements of someone who had already decided how the evening ended. His sister, Brooke, was performing a kind of elaborate indifference, scrolling something on her phone under the table. Her husband, Colin, sat beside her, watching me with the specific attentiveness of a man who had been briefed on tonight's agenda and was interested in seeing it execute. This was the Ashworths' annual Christmas dinner. This was what I had married into 2.5 years ago, when I was 29 years old and believed, genuinely believed, that love was enough of a foundation to build on. Before I tell you what I put on that table instead of my signature, and why, 20 minutes later, there were 2 vehicles in the driveway that were not there when we arrived. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments, because this is a story about what happens when the people who decided what you were worth end up sitting directly across from everything they missed. Have you ever been in a room full of people who were polite to your face while quietly, methodically deciding your future without you? If you have, stay with me. Because tonight, I was done being polite back. Lorraine folded her hands on the tablecloth and looked at me with the expression she reserved for things she found manageable but disappointing. Slow contractors, incorrect wine temperatures, and me. "Audrey," she said, making my name sound like a minor administrative problem, "you're a reasonable person. I've always thought that about you. You're practical, and I respect that. What we're asking tonight is not about hostility. It's about protecting what this family has built over 40 years. Surely you can understand that." "A postnuptial agreement," I said, 2.5 years in. "Protection works in both directions," Kenneth said, setting down his carving knife. "My father built this company from a single lumber yard in Barrie. What we have now didn't come easily. That's not a criticism of you, it's a fact about us." "It feels like a criticism of me," I said. Brooke looked up from her phone. She had a smile she had been refining since the first dinner I attended as James's girlfriend, the one that said she found me charming, the way you find a child's drawing charming. Affectionate, faintly superior. "Nobody is attacking you, Audrey. We're just being realistic. You came into this family without a lot of financial standing. That's not a judgment, it's just context. If things don't work out between you and James, we'd like clarity on what that looks like." "Your financial standing?" Those 3 words had followed me around this house for 2.5 years. They meant the apartment in Hamilton where I grew up, where my mum worked double shifts at a distribution centre for most of my childhood, where we clicked grocery coupons and bought winter boots in March because that's when they went on sale. They meant the fact that I put myself through university on OSAP and a part-time job at a campus IT desk. They meant that I'd arrived at the Ashworth family table from a direction they recognized as lesser, and that recognition had calcified into certainty before I ever opened my mouth. They have never asked what I did, not really. James had told them early on that I worked in tech, and Lorraine had nodded the way you nod at something that doesn't require further engagement. The subject never came up again. To the Ashworths, I was a pretty girl from Hamilton who had landed their son and was now a statistically plausible liability. They were not entirely wrong about strategic thinking, they were just wrong about which one of us was doing it. I'm not signing it, I said. The table went still. James finally looked up at me. His expression was complicated in the way that expressions get when a person has been making a series of quiet compromises for years and is now watching the accumulated interest come due, part guilt, part warning, part something that looked, if I was reading it right, like relief. The specific relief of a man who has been waiting for someone else to say the thing he couldn't. Audrey, he started. I'm not signing it, I said again in the same tone Lorraine had used. Quiet, settled. I had been practicing it. Kenneth leaned back in his chair. Then you need to understand what you're walking into. I have a call with our family solicitor tomorrow morning. We proceed with divorce on the grounds that you misrepresented your circumstances going into this marriage. You presented yourself to this family as someone without significant financial interests. If that turns out to be inaccurate in any material way, James has grounds. Misrepresentation, I said. That's interesting. Colin cleared his throat. He had gone to Osgood for law school, which he mentioned the way other people mentioned the weather, as neutral background fact. Audrey, we've done our due diligence. We know what your company's incorporated filings show. Revenue under $60,000 last year. We're not here to embarrass you. We're here to be honest. I looked at Colin for a long moment. He had gone to Osgood, I knew that. I also knew that he had been running a side investment account through a numbered company in Alberta that he had not disclosed on the Ashworth's family trust documents, that the account held a position in a junior mining company that had received advance notice of a regulatory decision it shouldn't have had, and that the contact who provided that notice worked at a consulting firm that was, as of 40 days ago, a subsidiary of a company I controlled. But I didn't say any of that, not yet. 60,000, I said. That's what the filing showed. Yes, Colin said with the satisfaction of someone holding a strong hand. Pull out your phones, I said. Search Northgate Systems. Northgate. Nobody moved. Please, I said. The word was so precisely controlled that Brooke actually reached for her phone before catching herself. Audrey, we're not going to... The rain started. Northgate Systems, I said again. It's fine. I'll wait. James's face had changed. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me in the beginning, before his family had worn at him slowly and patiently, the way the Niagara River wears at shale, with something that looked like wonder, like he had just remembered a version of me that the last 2 years had caused him to lose track of. He picked up his phone. He typed. He read. I watched the color leave his face. What is this? He started, and stopped. Kenneth frowned at his son, then reached for his own phone. Lorraine looked at her husband with the expression of a woman who has never once in her life needed to look anything up and found the suggestion mildly offensive. Brooke went very still. Colin's jaw tightened in a way he probably thought wasn't visible. Northgate Systems was not the name on my business cards. It was not what I introduced myself with at conferences. It was the parent entity, the company that sat above the companies that sat above the things people could actually see. I had structured it that way deliberately, not to conceal. When you build something real, it doesn't need to be legible to people who aren't paying attention. The last valuation reported in a Globe and Mail feature 17 months ago was $940 million. The piece had focused on our IP portfolio in infrastructure software. We had grown since then. The Ashworth's total family assets, Kennett's construction holdings, the Oakville property, the commercial real estate in the Niagara region, sat at approximately $180 million. I knew this because I had reviewed their financial exposure during a due diligence process before one of my subsidiaries extended a credit facility to their primary construction firm 14 months ago. They knew the name of the lender. They didn't know who owned it. This isn't, Kenneth started. Possible? I offered. You've been running this since before you and James, Lorraine said. Her voice had not changed. That impressed me, even now. She was a woman who did not permit herself visible shock. I incorporated Northgate when I was 26, I said. The $60,000 in the filing Colin mentioned belongs to a holding entity I use for administrative purposes. It has nothing to do with the operating company. I picked up the postnuptial agreement and held it for a moment. I understand why you had this drawn up. You thought you were protecting something. You thought the math was simple. James has assets, I don't. Therefore the risk runs one direction. You looked at me and saw a category. How? James said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the sound of a version of reality coming apart at a seam. I didn't lie to you, I said, and I meant it. I had told James I had a company. I had told him it was growing. I had told him on our second date, sitting on the steps outside a faux restaurant on King Street East, because we hadn't wanted the night to end, that I was building something I intended to still be running in 20 years. He had smiled and said that sounded ambitious. He had not asked follow-up questions. Neither had his family. That was the thing about the Ashworths. They saw a category, and categories, in their experience, did not require investigation. So this was what? Brooke started. You've been hiding this, to make us feel foolish? To prove something? Lorraine said. I haven't been hiding anything, I said. You never asked. There was a silence that settled over the table the way snow settles, quietly, thoroughly changing the shape of everything. My mind went somewhere else, the way minds do when the present moment starts to feel like a replay of something older. I went back 2.5 years. A welcome dinner, Lorraine had called it. 6 weeks after James and I got engaged, I had driven up from Hamilton in a dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, which I couldn't entirely afford because I wanted to make a good impression, before I understood that the impression had been filed before I arrived. After dessert, while James was in the other room talking to his father about a construction project in Mississauga, Lorraine had found me in the hallway near the coat closet. She had a glass of red wine, and the manner of a woman delivering something she considered a kindness. I want to be straight with you, she had said, because I think honesty is a form of respect, and I think you're someone who can handle it. James is generous. He has always been generous. He loves easily and trusts easily, and those are beautiful things about him that have also, historically, left him exposed. I need you to know that this family looks out for itself, whatever your intentions are, and I'll take you at your word that they're sincere. I want you to know that we will be watching. I had stood there in the hallway with my coat and said something even-toned and left the house 5 minutes later. I sat in my car in their driveway for a while before I could drive. I had thought about my mum, who had never once, in all the years I had brought people home, said anything like that to anyone I cared about. Who made tea and asked questions and laughed at things people said. Who, when I told her I was starting a company at 26 with $30,000 in savings and 2 clients and a lot of nerve, had said, "You always knew how to build things. What do you need from me?" I had thought about the 12 people who worked for me at the time, who were trusting me to make good decisions, who didn't know yet how large what we were building would eventually become. I had thought about myself at 23, sitting in the computer lab at McMaster at 2 in the morning, running simulations that weren't working, too stubborn to stop, with the particular stubbornness of someone who knows the idea is right even when the execution keeps failing. I had thought, they will not take this from me. Whatever else happens inside this family, this is mine. I came back to the table, to the silence, to Lorraine's face which had shifted, not to shame, not to shock, but to something more precise, recalculation. The expression of someone rerunning a spreadsheet with new variables. Well, she said, and then stopped. Which was the first time I'd ever seen Lorraine Ashworth stop mid-sentence. There's something else, I said. And here is where I want to be honest. Because looking back, what I did next was not the behavior of someone who had simply risen above it. It was the behavior of someone who had been patient for 2.5 years, carefully, deliberately patient, and had finally reached the place where patience expires. I reached into my bag and took out a manila envelope. I set it on the table next to the postnuptial agreement. 14 months ago, I said, your construction firm, Ashworth Building Group, refinanced a significant portion of its commercial portfolio. The lender was Lakeview Capital Partners. The credit facility was $8.5 million. I looked at Kenneth. I acquired a controlling interest in Lakeview Capital 8 months after that transaction, which means I now hold the note on your credit line. I slid a single document across the table. The line entered technical default 32 days ago. A scheduled repayment was missed, not by much, but missed. Kenneth stood up. Sit down, I said, quietly. The surprise of hearing it said that way, not aggressive, just final, made him pause long enough that he actually sat back down. You can't. I'm not calling the loan, I said. I want to be very clear about that. I have no interest in destabilizing your business. What I have is documentation, and what I want is for everyone at this table to understand what the actual numbers look like, since we're doing due diligence. I turned to Colin. The numbered company you've been running through Crestwood Advisory, I said. It received material non-public information about a regulatory decision affecting a TSX venture stock before that decision was public. The source of that information was a contact at a firm called Pelham Strategy Group. Pelham was acquired by a Northgate subsidiary in October. Their internal communications are now subject to our compliance process. I let that settle. I provided the relevant documentation to OSC's Enforcement Division 11 days ago. Victoria turned to look at her husband. Colin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I want to be clear, I said to the table, that I did not plan this evening. I did not arrange for any of this to come together tonight. You invited me here. You put that document on the table. You chose this dinner. I just arrived prepared. I closed the envelope. Lorraine was looking at me in a way I had never seen her look at anything, not with anger, not with shame, but with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they have been playing a game they did not know they were in. What is it you want, Audrey? She finally asked. I want my husband to look at me, I said. James looked up. I want you to understand, I said to him, that I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because for 2.5 years I have sat in this house and let your family tell me, quietly and politely, that I was a liability, that I was a risk to be managed, that the category they put me in before they ever knew me was the correct one. And I kept quiet because I thought, if I'm patient enough, if I don't react, if I just keep building what I'm building, eventually they'll see it. Eventually you'll say something. I looked at him steadily. That document they put on the table tonight, did you know about it? He looked down at his wineglass. James, did you know? They told me it was routine, he said quietly. A formality. Just to clarify things. To clarify things, I repeated. Audrey, I didn't think it would. No, I said, you didn't think. Something moved in the driveway. Tires on the interlock pavers Kenneth had installed 3 summers ago, then the sound of car doors. Lorraine turned toward the window. Kenneth pushed back his chair. 2 sets of headlights were moving up the private drive. That would be the OSC investigators, I said. They're not here for dinner. I agreed to be present for the initial meeting with the relevant parties. Colin can speak with them here or come in voluntarily to their offices in Toronto on Thursday. That was the arrangement I agreed to. I looked at Colin. I advocated for the home option because I thought it would be less disruptive. You're welcome. This is insane, Brooke said. Her voice had come up an octave. You can't do this in someone's house on Christmas. Colin can walk out with them now or come in on Thursday, I said again. Those were the terms I negotiated. Colin was looking at the envelope the way you look at something you know is not going to move. I stood up. I want to say one thing, I said, and I want to say it clearly, because I think it's the most important thing that happens at this table tonight. I looked at Lorraine. I don't hate you. I want to be specific about that. I am not doing this out of hatred, and I am not doing this to win anything. I'm doing this because you sat across from me tonight and handed me a 14-page document and a very nice pen and told me to sign away my rights because you had already decided 2.5 years ago what I was worth. And I sat here. I ate dinner. I passed the squash. I let you say every word you intended to say because I think if you were going to do this, you should get to do it completely and I should get to respond completely. You've made your point, Kenneth said tightly. I've made a start, I said. The point is this, I was never hiding from you, you just never looked. There's a difference. And the next time you sit across from someone and decide in advance what category they belong to, I'd suggest asking one more question before you print 14 pages on expensive paper and put a pen beside it like it's part of the place setting. I picked up my bag. I looked at James one more time. I'm going to stay at the Broadview tonight, I said. The hotel on the Danforth. If you want to talk, actually talk, not Ashworth talk, actual conversation, you know where I am. I'm still your wife. I would like, genuinely, to figure out if that means something to both of us, independent of everything that just happened in this room. But that requires you to make a decision. And only you can do that. I buttoned my coat. I'll see myself out. Behind me I heard the doorbell ring. Heard Kenneth stand. Heard Lorraine say something in a low voice I didn't try to catch. Heard Brooke say Colin's name once, sharp, the way you say a name when you already know the answer to the question you're not asking. I didn't stop. Outside, the December air was clean in the way Canadian winter air gets after a fresh snow, not punishing, just clarifying, the kind of cold that makes everything precise. My boots made noise on the salted front walkway. I passed the first car in the driveway. A woman in a dark coat gave me a brief nod. I nodded back. I had parked at the end of the circular drive, nose out. I had done that on purpose. When I started the engine, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, watching the house in my rearview mirror. Every window was lit. The Christmas lights on the eaves were on timers. They had been on since before we arrived, and they would stay on long after tonight. The house had the particular certainty of structures that have been in one family long enough to stop being buildings and become facts. My phone lit up, a text from my operations director, Kenji. Lakeview documentation confirmed as filed. Also, B&N Business wants a comment on the Northgate infrastructure announcement. Want a schedule for Monday? I typed back. Monday's fine. Send something from the team for the holidays. It's been a long quarter for everyone. I thought about calling my mum. I would call her tomorrow from somewhere quiet, and she would ask how I was doing in the way she always asked, not as a formality, as an actual question. And whatever I said, she would find the part of it that was manageable without making it smaller than it was. She had a gift for that. She had always had that gift. I thought about James. About the first time I saw him at a startup conference in Waterloo before I knew his family's name or what it meant in certain circles in Ontario. He had gone and turned around looking for a session room, and when I pointed him in the right direction he had said, "I've been walking past that sign for 10 minutes," and laughed at himself immediately, without embarrassment, without performance. And I had thought, that is a person who is comfortable being human. I had thought, that is someone real. I still believe that was in there. Under 2.5 years of Ashworth gravity, under the dinners and the silences and the quiet accumulation of a family's disapproval, I still believed the version of him I had met in Waterloo existed. Whether he could find his way back to it was not something I could do for him. I put the car in gear. The gates at the end of the driveway were automated. They opened as I approached, and I drove through them without stopping, and they closed behind me in the rearview mirror. And then I was on the road south toward the QEW, and the house was just lights behind me in the dark, and the lights got smaller, and then they were gone. I didn't feel the way I had expected to feel. I had expected to feel something large and definitive. I had expected relief or triumph or the particular satisfaction of a long project finally complete. What I felt instead was something quieter, the specific stillness that comes at the end of a long effort, not emptiness, not victory, but the feeling of having finally said the thing you have been carrying for 2.5 years, out loud, in full, to the people it was meant for. I had walked into that house at 29 years old as a woman who had already built something extraordinary and spent 2.5 years allowing people who had never once asked a real question about me to define what I was. I had not gone back to correct them tonight. I had gone back because they pushed it, because they put a pen next to a gravy boat and thought that was the end of it. The difference, it turned out, was everything. I merged onto the highway heading east, toward the city, toward the lights of Toronto spreading across the horizon ahead of me, and I turned on the radio, and I drove. I used to think that patience was passive, that waiting quietly was the same as doing nothing. That night in Oakville, sitting at that table with a pen placed next to a gravy boat like it was part of the cutlery, I understood that patience is one of the most active things a person can practice. It requires choosing every single day not to react, not because you can't, but because you know the moment isn't right yet, and you trust yourself enough to wait for it. The Ashworths looked at me and saw a category, a woman from Hamilton, a girl whose mother worked at a distribution center, someone who had arrived at their table from the wrong direction, and they never questioned that assessment, not once, because in their experience categories didn't require investigation. That is not a small failure. That is a failure of the mind, the kind that happens when people stop being curious about the world and start assuming they already understand it. What I built because I refused to accept someone else's assessment of what was possible for me. That takes something harder than confidence. Confidence is easy when things are going well. What carried me through the nights in that computer lab at McMaster, through the years of building something while a family quietly decided I was nothing, that was a different thing entirely. It was the decision, made over and over again, to keep going when stopping would have been easier, not because anyone was watching, not for the satisfaction of proving anyone wrong, but because the work itself was real, and I knew it, and that knowledge was enough. I think about what my mum modeled for me without ever naming it as a lesson. She never told me that integrity mattered. She just lived it, every shift, every coupon, every honest answer to a hard question. When I walked out of that house in Oakville and sat in my car with the engine running, the first person I thought about calling was her. Not to report a victory, just to hear her voice and be reminded of where my real compass came from. The things that happened to Colin that evening were not things I invented. They were consequences that had been accumulating long before I arrived at that dinner. I simply documented what was already true. I think that distinction matters. There is a difference between revenge and accountability, and the difference lives in your own intentions when you decide to act. What I want, looking back, is not for anyone to feel sorry for the version of me who sat quietly at those dinners for 2.5 years. That woman was not suffering. She was building. She was watching. She was learning what she needed to learn about who these people were before she made any decisions. The Ashworths handed me a document and expected me to sign it because they had never once considered that the math might run the other direction. That is what happens when we stop asking questions and start assuming. We miss things. Sometimes we miss everything. I drove back to the city that night and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular quiet of a person who has finally said out loud what they have been carrying for a long time. There is no shortcut to that feeling. You earn it through the work, through the choices you make when no one is watching, through the slow, honest accumulation of a life you actually built yourself. That is the only story worth telling,